The buzzing lights above me felt louder than they should have been. 20 years in the system, and all I walked out with was a brass key, a faded note, and a message that shouldn't have known my name. Go to Ashwind Farm. The tractor remembers. The wind had a way of never quite stopping in that part of the American West, always moving across the high country like it had old stories to carry, ruffling what was left of last summer's grass and dragging low clouds across a washed-out October sky. Out past the edge of Prescott, where the asphalt gave up and the hills began to rise in layered shades of brown and pine green, there were cabins, half forgotten by maps and fence posts, leaning like tired men, and it was in places like that that a man like Calder Rowen usually felt most himself. He was 30 years old and already had the look of a mountain man someone had left too long in the lowlands. Tall and rangy, shoulders roped with the kind of muscle you get from lifting things that don't want to move. Dark hair kept short, more from habit than vanity, and a jawline shadowed with stubble that never quite went away. His eyes were a gray that matched winter sky over the ridges, quiet and watchful, like he was always half listening for something just out of earshot. He wore the same kind of clothes men in the high country wore when no one was looking, a sun-faded flannel shirt, a jean jacket that had seen better decades, and a pair of worn denim jeans tucked into scuffed work boots, everything in earth tones that didn't mind dust. Calder wasn't born into that world of cabins and ridge lines and dirt roads, but whenever the group home had arranged volunteer work up near the tree line or weekend labor on a rancher's property, he'd taken it, clinging to the smell of sap and cold air like it was the only thing that proved he was real and not just another file in a metal cabinet. The one constant that followed him between the institutional walls and the wild edges was Coda, the husky he'd found as a shivering ball of bones and fur behind the kitchen dumpsters of the children's home 8 years earlier. Eyes too big for his starving body. Coda had grown into a powerful dog with a thick coat of gray and white that caught every stray beam of light. Ears always pricked, tail a brush of restless energy, and eyes the color of old ice, sharp, alert, and too knowing for comfort. He was the kind of dog who slept light, who paced when storms rolled in, whose head always turned first at a sound in the night, and who chose Calder once and never seemed interested in reconsidering. When Chapter 1 of this story truly began, though, they weren't in a cabin or on a ridge. They were under humming fluorescent lights that made everything feel too bright and too flat. The director's office at the Prescott orphanage smelled like paper and lemon cleaner, and Calder sat in a chair that had held 1,000 other kids before him, boots planted wide on dull linoleum, Coda lying at his feet like a silent piece of shadow. The lights buzzed overhead with that tired electric whine that burrowed into your skull if you listened too long. Across the desk, Mrs. Halpern, small, efficient, gray hair pinned into a tight coil, glasses perched low on a nose that had seen its share of size, shuffled a manila folder as if the weight of it were something she could reduce by moving pages from one pile to another. Lines around her mouth suggested she'd once smiled easily. The deeper lines at the corners of her eyes said life had taught her that smiles were rationed things. "Well, Calder," she said, her voice the brittle kind of gentle adults used when they were tired of watching kids grow up and leave. "You know how this goes. You turned 18 a long time ago. The state's done more than it usually does, keeping you on as live-in maintenance while you worked odd jobs. But you're 30 now. They're cutting funding. We can't keep you here any longer." He nodded once, not because he agreed or disagreed, but because arguing with the system was like arguing with the wind. He'd mowed the lawns, fixed faucets, patched drywall, stayed in the half-forgotten corner room because no one had anywhere better to put him. The address on his ID was the same as the one printed on the front gate of the children's home. That was the kind of fact that sat heavy inside a man. She pushed the folder across the desk. Birth certificate, medical records, some school reports. The state doesn't have much on you. You know that. Her eyes flicked down Dakota, who watched her without blinking, then back up. Something in her expression softened for a heartbeat. You can keep the dog. No one's going to argue with you about that. As his hand landed on the folder, he noticed there was more than just papers inside. Tucked at the very bottom was an envelope the color of old tea, edges curled. His name written across the front in ink that had feathered into the fibers over time. Calder paused. "This yours?" he asked, frowning. Mrs. Halpern leaned forward, squinting. The way her brows pulled together said this letter hadn't been on her mind in years, if ever. "That must have come in with your intake paperwork," she said slowly. "Before my time here. Some things get buried, especially with older cases. We don't usually give them to the kids until they age out, but—" She glanced at the clock, then at the empty hallway beyond the office window. "Looks like the system kept this one longer than it should have." His fingers were rough and a little clumsy as he tore the flap. Inside was a folded scrap of paper and something that slid heavy and metallic into his palm. The paper smelled faintly of dust and something he couldn't name, like hay that had seen many summers. Written in a hand that was careful but not elegant were the words, "When you're strong enough, come here. The tractor knows. Jay." Beneath that, on the same page as if added in a hurry, were 4 more words that changed the way the room seemed to tilt. Ashwind Farm, Wyoming. He stared at the letters until they blurred, until they stopped being shapes and started being roads stretching north across mountains he'd never seen. The object in his hand was a brass key, old but well-made, edges smoothed by time, attached to a cracked leather tag stamped with the same words as on the paper. Ashwind Farm. For a moment, Calder couldn't move. His life up to this point had been defined by what he didn't have. No names, no faces, no stories that belonged to him outside of what he'd carved out with calloused hands and quiet nights. This was something else. A hand reaching out of the past, however late, and saying, "There is a door only you can open." "Do you know this place?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. Mrs. Halpern shook her head, a small, helpless gesture. "I'm afraid not. Your file says you were left at the county hospital. Unknown parents. That's all. Whoever Jay is, they never came through me." There was a moment then, a quiet pocket of time where the hum of the lights, the ticking of a cheap plastic clock, and the soft exhale of Coda's breath all seemed to stack on top of one another. Calder let the brass key rest in his palm, feeling the cool weight of it, the way it didn't quite match any lock he'd known. By the time he stood up, decision had settled in his bones the way winter settled in the mountains, slowly, but for good. He walked out of the only building that had technically ever been his home, with $72 in his wallet, a duffel bag that held everything he owned worth packing, a husky who refused to leave his side, and a key tied to a mystery that pointed him toward a state he'd never set foot in. The bus station at dusk was a place that looked the same in every small city, a handful of tired people pretending they weren't reading each other's lives in the scuffs of their shoes and the frayed edges of their jackets. Calder bought the cheapest one-way ticket that pointed vaguely toward Wyoming and found a seat near the back, Coda curling up under his legs with reluctant patience. As the bus pulled away from Prescott, the lights of the town fell behind them, swallowed one by the vastness waiting outside. Through the smudged glass, he watched the land unfold, mesas and juniper giving way to higher, sharper country, sky stretching wider, clouds dragged along like slow ships. The farther north they went, the colder the air that seeped in around the window edges. Somewhere along the way the bus changed, then changed again, and the names on the signs grew fewer and farther between, until finally a hand-painted board announced they had reached Red Willow. Red Willow wasn't much by anyone's measure. A strip of brick front buildings, a faded gas station, a grain elevator standing like a lone sentinel against the sky, and the kind of main street where you could hear your boots on the sidewalk. The wind knifed through his jacket the moment he stepped off the bus, carrying with it the dry, high scent of sage and dust. This was plateau country, hard and beautiful, with mountains distant but present on the horizon, their snowcaps catching weak sunlight. Calder hitched his duffel higher on his shoulder and whistled once. Coda leapt down beside him, nostrils flaring, tail lifted, body alive with the kind of alertness that only open country seemed to wake in him. The diner sat on the corner, its neon sign flickering between Rosie's and Ozie's, but the warmth that spilled out when he opened the door was steady. Inside, the place smelled like coffee, bacon grease, and the kind of pie that cooled on windowsills in stories. There were a few ranch hands nursing late lunches, a couple of old-timers folded into a booth near the back, and behind the counter, a woman in her late 20s or maybe 30, wiping down a mug with a focus that said her hands needed something to do. She had wheat blonde hair pulled into a low braid, a few loose strands curling around a face that might have smiled easy once, but had learned to hide its softness. Her eyes were a clear prairie blue, but there was a tiredness at the edges, as if she'd seen more endings than beginnings. The name tag pinned to her flannel shirt read, Lena. "Sit anywhere you like," she called, voice warm but carrying that same careful distance. Calder chose a stool at the counter, Coda settling on the floor with his head between his paws, eyes tracking every movement. Lena poured coffee into a chipped mug and slid it toward him. "You're not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," he answered, fingers wrapping around the mug, letting the heat sink into his skin. "Just passing through. At least, that's the plan." She studied him for a second, taking in the worn clothes, the out-of-state dust on his boots, the way the dog stayed close like they'd done a lot of miles together. "Passing through Red Willow means you either got lost," she said lightly, "or you're looking for something real specific." He thought about lying, but there was something about the way her gaze held his, steady and unafraid, that made honesty feel less dangerous than usual. Calder reached into his pocket and laid the brass key on the counter between them. The leather tag turned so the words faced her. "You ever heard of a place called Ashwind Farm?" For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The clink of forks, the murmur of conversation behind him, even the jukebox in the corner seemed to dim. Lena's eyes dropped to the tag, and all the color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. When she did speak, her voice was lower, threaded with something like old fear. "Ashwind Farm," she repeated. "People around here don't go out there anymore." She glanced toward the front window as though expecting the wind itself to eavesdrop. "It's east of town, maybe 5 miles, out past the last of the good fences. Place has been empty for
years. Bad winters, bad stories."
She swallowed, then forced herself to meet his gaze again. "Why'd you ask?" Calder shrugged one shoulder, the motion rougher than he intended. "Got a note," he said. "Said when I was strong enough, I should come. Said the tractor knows. That mean anything to you?" Something moved behind her eyes then, not recognition exactly, but the memory of having heard the shape of those words before. maybe in a hushed conversation or half-drunk confession she wished she'd forgotten. Lena exhaled slowly, set the mug she'd been drying down a little too carefully. "There are some things folks here don't talk about," she said. "But the land remembers. So do the machines that worked it." Then, as if catching herself before she said more than she should, she straightened. "If you're set on going, you follow Old Mill Road out of town until the pavement turns to gravel. Keep east when the road forks. You'll see the sign, or what's left of it." She reached behind her without looking, grabbed an old metal thermos from a hook and filled it with coffee. When she pressed it into his hand, there was a flicker of something softer in her expression, some small, stubborn kindness that refused to die. "Take this. Wind out there cuts through a man faster than he thinks. And be careful, all right?" Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and in that instant he caught the faintest glimpse of a life behind her eyes, a wedding ring that wasn't on her finger anymore, a highway stretching away from Red Willow and then looping back, a heart that had tried to start over and found itself right where it began. But the moment passed, like so many others in a world that didn't pause for long. 2 hours later, Calder and Coda were walking, boots crunching over a dirt road that had forgotten what traffic felt like, thermos tucked into his pack, the key a solid presence against his thigh. The sky above them was a heavy sheet of gray, the kind that made the horizon blur and turned distance into a guess. On either side, fields lay fallow and brown, tufts of dry grass bending under the steady push of the wind. No birdsong, no engines, just the sound of their own footsteps and the soft jingle of Coda's collar. The dog moved ahead and then back again, nose low, tail a metronome of unease, as if he sensed they were walking toward something that hadn't decided yet whether they were welcome. When they finally saw it, Ashwind Farm didn't look like a place that could hold answers. The drive had almost disappeared beneath the weeds, ruts filled in by seasons of neglect. The first thing that rose out of the dull sweep of land was the barn, a 2-story wooden skeleton with peeling red paint clinging to its boards like memories that refused to let go. Sheets of rusted metal roofing curled up at the edges, rattling softly whenever the wind shifted. The main door hung crooked on a single hinge, yawning, open into darkness. Near it, hunched in the yard like an old animal too stubborn to lie down, was a tractor. It had once been red, the kind of bright, proud color men associated with hard work and long days, but now it was dulled to a tired, flaking rust. One of the front tires had sunk halfway into the earth, swallowed slowly over years. Thistles and dry weeds had grown up around it, but the machine itself still held a kind of dignity, as if it were waiting for someone to remember its name. Calder stopped a few yards away, breath coming in small white clouds in front of his mouth. Coda's fur lifted along his spine, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Not a warning, exactly, but a sound a creature makes when it recognizes something old and unsettled. Calder had the sudden, unnerving sensation that the place was looking back at him, not with eyes, but with the accumulated weight of years. That the barn, the house in the distance with its sagging porch, and the silent tractor all knew something about him he didn't yet know about himself. He moved toward the machine, boots sinking slightly into the soft, neglected earth. Up close, the tractor's chipped paint and dents told a story of storms, rocks, and stubborn land. The seat was the old spring-loaded kind, cracked and weathered, the metal frame beneath it stained with oil and time. He ran a hand along the side of it, fingers tracing a line in the dust, then paused. There, tucked just beneath the seat where a man might stash a wrench or a pair of gloves, was the corner of something wooden, dark with age. Calder gripped the edge of the seat and hauled up. For a moment it resisted, groaning in protest. then gave way with a sharp creak, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside, nestled like it had been put to bed a long time ago, was a box about the size of a shoebox, carved from wood so smooth it caught what little light there was. A small brass lock shaped like a stylized star, or a flower, depending on how you looked at it, winked up at him. And in that instant, the key in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if it had been waiting for this meeting from the moment someone pressed it into an envelope and sent it toward an uncertain future. His hands weren't entirely steady as he slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, decisive click that echoed louder in his head than it did in the air. The lid lifted easily. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth gone soft with the years, was a photograph. He unfolded it, and the breath left his lungs. A younger man stood in front of this very barn, shoulders broad, hair wind-tossed, face caught in that awkward place between pride and fear. In his arms, cradled like something both fragile and indestructible, was a baby, swaddled tight. The man's eyes were the same winter gray as Calder's. He didn't need anyone to tell him that. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful hand as the note that had started him north, were words that made the whole world narrow down to the space between his fingertips. Calder, 3 days old. My son. For a long moment, all he could do was stand there, the wind tugging at his jacket, coda pressed close to his leg, the weight of the years and miles and empty spaces between that moment in the photo and this one crushing and liberating all at once. He had spent 3 decades believing he was nobody from nowhere, a name stapled to a file, a body filling up a bed that would later be given to someone else. Now, in the shadow of a dying barn and beside a tractor that had remembered what so many people had forgotten, the truth settled over him. He had a father. He had a place. And whether he understood it yet or not, he had come home. For a long time, Calder just stood there in the yard, fingers locked around that photograph until the edges dug into his skin, the wind worrying at his jacket like it was trying to pull him back toward the road. The barn loomed at his side, all splintered boards and sagging rafters, and the old red tractor hunkered beside him like a witness that had seen far more than anyone ever asked it to tell. Coda leaned against his leg, pressing solid weight into him, those ice-blue eyes searching his face as if gauging whether the man he'd followed this far was going to stay standing or fold. Eventually, when his heartbeat stopped thundering quite so loud in his ears, Calder remembered the box. The photograph hadn't been the only thing inside. He knelt again, joints cracking in protest, and set the picture carefully aside on the tractor's fender. The cloth-wrapped bundle in the wooden box had more give than just paper. When he unrolled it fully, he found a sheaf of pages folded together, their edges yellowed, the ink gone to a soft brown. The first page began with his name, written out in a hand that leaned to the right, solid and a little shaky, like a man who'd learned to be steady no matter what his body thought of it. "My son," it said, and the words blurred for a second before he forced his focus back into line. "My name is Jonas Rowen. If you are reading this, it means you found your way to Ashwind in spite of everything this world did to keep us apart. I pray that means you are strong enough to hear the truth." The letter unspooled like a slow confession. Jonas wrote of a small, hopeful marriage that had burned bright and short, of a woman with a laugh like creek water over stone who carried their child and did not survive the carrying. Calder read about a winter storm and a drive to the hospital on ice-slick roads, about hands that did everything they could and still came away empty. "Your mother died the day you came into this world," the letter said. That was the first time my heart broke. The second was when they told me what I could not do. Jonas had been hurt not long before, a tractor accident in the north field, a misjudged slope, a roll that had left his back and ribs shattered and his breath forever a little shorter. He wrote about the way the doctors talked around him in the ICU, about the social worker with kind eyes but careful words, about state regulations and fitness evaluations. I wanted to bring you here, to this place your mother loved, he wrote. I wanted you to run these fields, to learn the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, to sit beside me on that tractor. But I was alone. No kin left, no wife, a farm already hanging by a thread, and a body that wouldn't always do what I asked it to. They told me you'd be better off in the system than with a broken old man and a dying piece of land. I believed them, and I have regretted it every day since. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and engine oil and the dry dust of Wyoming years. Jonas didn't spare himself in the telling. He called his choice what it was: fear and exhaustion wrapped in the clothes of responsibility. But threaded through all the lines of failure and apology was something steady and stubborn. I never stopped looking for a way back to you. He wrote about hiring a woman from town, Mrs. Grady, a nurse with a wide laugh and a spine of iron, to act as his bridge to the outside world. She'd taken photographs when the state sent updated records, tiny school portraits and grainy hallway snapshots, slipping copies out the back door to mail them up to the farm. Jonas had kept them all, even when his fingers started to shake too much to pin them straight on the wall. Then one day the letters stopped coming. Months later he found out why. A wreck on the highway in a snowstorm, a jackknifed truck, a list of the dead that included the only person who'd been willing to bend rules for him. After that, the silence around his son hardened into something almost physical. By then, he wrote, the doctors had found the problem in his chest. A heart that didn't want to finish the job it started, he called it with grim humor. He put Ashwind into a trust, the best way a man like him knew how, using a lawyer in a town 3 hours away and a bank account under enough lock and key that the state couldn't sniff it out and reclaim the land for unpaid taxes. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. The title to 110 acres of worn-out fields, a weather-beaten house, a barn, and a modest fund that might, if a man was careful, keep the place from falling entirely to ruin before its true owner came home. If, the letter repeated more than once, you ever come home. On the last page, the handwriting deteriorated into a more jagged scrawl. The words crowded each other as if time had been running shorter than ink. If you find this, Jonas wrote, it means you have already done something I never could. You walked back into a place that hurt you and picked up a thread the world tried to cut. If you can stand here and read these words, then maybe, just maybe, you are strong enough to forgive an old coward who loved you more than he knew how to show. If you come here, son, you will be the only miracle my life ever got. The light had gone thin and blue by the time Calder folded the last page. He hadn't noticed the evening curling in, but now the sky over the pasture was bruised and the cold slid deeper under his collar. He tucked the letter and the photograph back into the box, then carried it into the barn because some part of him couldn't stand the idea of those words sitting out in the open night. The barn's interior smelled of old hay and older memories, dust motes turning lazily in the slats of fading light that slipped through cracks in the siding. Birds had nested in the rafters at some point. Their droppings spattered the beams like a crude constellation map. Calder set the box on an overturned crate and sank onto an old hay bale, elbows on knees, Coda settling at his feet with a low woof of contentment that didn't quite match the tension in his own chest. For a while he just listened, to the barn creaking around him as the temperature dropped, to the far-off hush of wind combing the fields, to his own breath going in and out. Like maybe that alone was work enough. It might have stayed that way if not for the sound, a faint, irregular tapping from the back corner of the barn where the shadows were thickest. Coda's head snapped up, ears pointed, a soft warning rumble starting somewhere deep in his throat. Calder rose slowly, muscles tightening in the wary, measured way of a man who'd learned that trouble rarely knocked politely. He crossed the barn with careful, quiet steps, boots whispering through old straw. The noise came again, softer this time, as if something small had shifted its weight or something looser than it should be had given way. There, in the far corner, a plank in the floor sat just a fraction higher than the boards around it, like a tooth slightly out of line. He crouched, ran his fingers along the edges, and felt the give. Not much, but enough. Someone had pried this up before, maybe many times. He wedged his hands at either side of the plank and pulled. For a moment it resisted, nails squealing in their beds. Then it jerked free with a shower of dust and the smell of dry rot. Beneath the floor lay a narrow cavity. Inside it sat a small metal safe, the kind a man buys when he owns more secrets than valuables. Beside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff with age, was another book. Calder hauled them both up into the thin light, coughed as dust rose around him in a choking halo. The safe was heavier than it looked, corners blunt against his palms. Its dial was scarred, the black paint worn off the numbers by fingers that had spun it countless times. Taped to the side in brittle, yellowing adhesive was a scrap of paper. 3 numbers written in the same rough hand as the letter. He didn't let himself think about trust or intention or the intimacy of a man leaving his private code for a son he'd never held past 3 days. He just dialed. Left, right, left. The lock clicked with a quiet, decisive finality that echoed the unlock of the box out by the tractor. Inside, nestled among folded envelopes and a bank book with more zeros than Calder had ever seen attached to his name, was a small tin containing a handful of snapshots. Not the copies Jonas had mentioned in the letter. Those, Calder would learn, were in a different place. But original prints, curling at the edges, showing the farm in better days. Fields green and thick, a younger Jonas perched on the tractor with his hand shading his eyes. A woman whose smile tugged at something deep in Calder's chest, even though he'd never see it in motion. The oilcloth-wrapped book, when he unrolled it, turned out to be a journal. The leather cover cracked, the pages inside filled margin to margin in Jonas's workmanlike hand. These were the days the letter had skimmed over, written in real time as they'd happened. Doctor visits and test results, nights when his heart hammered too fast, mornings when it forgot its job for a beat too long. In between were entries about money counted and recounted, about meetings with that distant lawyer, about the day he'd found just the right way to hide the trust so the state couldn't unravel it, about a nurse named Grady who brought news of the boy and slipped photographs into his calloused hands. Scattered among the lines of practical planning were other moments that hit harder. The way Jonas described hearing a toddler laugh for the first time over a crackling phone line. The way his writing faltered when he learned about the wreck that took Mrs. Grady off the road and out of his life. The way he kept writing to Calder anyway. Letters never mailed, but tucked between journal pages like prayers pressed into an old Bible. On the final page, the handwriting leaned and stuttered, as if each stroke cost him something. If you stand here someday, Jonas had written, in this barn with this book in your hands, then know this. Every time that heart of mine stuttered and stumbled and finally quit, it had your name on it. If you are here, alive and grown and strong enough to lift these boards, then you are the one good thing this world let me be part of. You are my miracle. By the time Calder reached that last sentence, the barn had gone almost completely dark. The only light came from the gaps in the roof where the first stars were beginning to pry their way into the sky. A gust of wind barreled through a missing board high up on the west wall, catching the dust that had risen with his work and spinning it into a brief, shimmering column that hung in the air between him and the open rafters. For a heartbeat, it looked like something more than dust, like a pillar of pale fireflies or the breath of the land itself made visible. Coda gave a single sharp bark at nothing Calder could see, then pressed himself up against his leg and went still, his earlier tension melting into a quiet he usually reserved for nights when the snow fell soft and the world felt small and safe. Calder wasn't a man given to visions. He didn't know what he believed about God or fate or the whispers old folks said the wind carried down out of the hills. But in that moment, with the pages of his father's last words trembling in his hands and the light making the air itself look holy, something inside him shifted. For the first time in his life, he felt the ground not as something he simply walked over, but as something that rose up to meet him, that knew his weight and chose not to let him fall through. He wasn't an extra body in a system anymore, not a mistake someone had filed away and forgotten. He was the answer to a hope stubborn enough to outlast a failing heart. He was wanted, not in some abstract way, but by name. He slept little that night, stretched out on an old mattress frame he'd dragged into a relatively dry corner of the farmhouse. Coda curled at his feet like a sentry. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ink of Jonas's handwriting, the slope of those letters spelling out his name. When dawn finally scraped a pale stripe across the horizon, he rose stiff and hollowed, but steadier than he'd felt in years. The cold bit harder in the early light, gnawing at his fingers as he stepped out onto the sagging porch. Frost rimed the weeds, turning the wasted field into a sea of silver spears. He was standing there, thermos cup of yesterday's coffee cooling in his hand, when he heard the grind of tires on gravel. A dusty blue pickup eased its way up the rutted drive, engine protesting the abuse. The driver's door creaked open and Lena climbed down, her braid stuffed inelegantly into a beanie, cheeks flushed from the morning chill. She had a cardboard box balanced on one hip and a grocery bag looped over her wrist. "You look like a man who didn't think past sunset," she called, half a smile hooking the corner of her mouth as she kicked the door shut with her boot. "Figured you might not have remembered things like food and coffee that isn't half motor oil." Up close, he could see she'd dressed in haste, flannel shirt buttoned wrong by one, a smear of flour on the cuff, the faint shadows under her eyes a little darker than yesterday. She smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon and the clean, sharp air of town. She followed him into the kitchen, set the box on the counter, and began pulling things out with brisk, practical movements. A loaf of bread wrapped in a dish towel, jars of soup, a bundle of apples, a thermos that steamed when she cracked the lid. Coda hovered like a polite ghost until she laughed and tossed him a strip of dried meat from her pocket, her hand brushing his head in an easy stroke that made his tail thump. "You didn't have to come all the way out here," Calder said quietly, feeling suddenly aware of the peeling paint and the stale smell of the house, as if she were seeing not just the place, but all the lack that had come before it. "Yeah, well," she replied, eyes flicking briefly to his and away again. "The last time I watched a man try to outrun his past, I let him do it alone. That didn't work out so well for either of us. Consider this. Me trying something different. There was a story there, in the angle of her jaw and the way her fingers tightened on the thermos for a second too long, but she didn't offer it, and he didn't ask. Instead, he told her his. Not all at once, not every jagged edge, but enough. The letter, the trust, the journals hidden under the barn floor, the photographs of a life that had always been just beyond his reach. As he spoke, Lena's eyes grew bright, and by the time he reached Jonas's last line, the one about miracles, her hand had come up to press against her mouth, as if holding something in. When he finished, the kitchen fell quiet, except for the tick of the old clock and Coda's soft chewing. "He loved you," she said finally, voice roughened. "In the only broken, messed up way he knew how. He really did." A tear tracked down her cheek. She swiped at it with an impatient thumb. "You don't have to carry all of that by yourself, you know. Nobody should have to stand in a place like this, reading words like that, and think they've got to be strong alone. Not anymore." The words hit a spot in him that had gone numb years ago. Before he could answer, she stepped closer. They ended up outside again, almost without noticing, drawn by the pull of open sky. They stood side by side in front of the barn, the same barn from the photograph, watching the wind move through the tall, dead grass like the hand of something unseen. Coda sprawled at their feet, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. After a moment, Lena reached out, almost cautiously, and laid her fingers on his forearm, just above his wrist. It wasn't a cling or a demand, just a point of steady warmth in a world that had been cold too long. He didn't pull away. The contact was small, but it held more than one kind of promise. The promise that someone saw the weight he carried, and the quieter promise that she might be willing to shoulder a corner of it if he let her. For a while they said nothing. The fields stretched away in every direction, bare and tired, but under the frost, Calder could almost imagine green pushing its way back when spring came. The house was a wreck. The fences were down, and the barn needed more love than he knew how to give. But for the first time, those facts didn't feel like a sentence. They felt like a challenge, like an invitation. "I can't just walk away from this," he said at last, more to the land than to her. "He held on to it for me. Feels like if I leave it to rot now, I'm letting him die twice." Lena nodded. "Then don't walk away," she answered simply. "Stay. Fix what you can, one board, one field at a time. I know some folks who can help you figure out what to plant without bankrupting yourself. I know a roofer who owes my uncle a favor. We can make a list." We. The word settled over him like another kind of blessing. They spent the next hour talking in practical circles, seasons and soil, which parts of the house were closest to falling in, how a man might stretch a modest fund until it started to look like something resembling a future. None of it was binding, none of it guaranteed, but as they spoke, Calder could feel the shape of his life starting to shift. This wasn't just about digging up what had been buried anymore. It was about deciding what to plant in its place. Later, much later, he would look back on that morning and know that it was the hinge the rest of his days swung on. The moment he chose not just to uncover the past, but to build something with it, and the moment a woman with tired blue eyes and flower on her sleeve chose to stand in that choice with him. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the scar tissue and the years of being no one from nowhere, a single clear thought rose up like a prayer. The day I found this farm, I thought I'd come here to dig up ghosts. Turns out God brought me here to find the rest of my life. In the end, Calder's journey reminds us of something many of us forget in the noise of everyday life. That God's miracles rarely arrive with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a forgotten letter, a dusty key, a stranger who shows us kindness, or a place we never knew our heart was waiting for. We all carry wounds, unanswered questions, and seasons of loneliness. But grace has a way of finding us when we finally stop running. And when it does, it often leads us exactly where we were meant to be all along. Heart, I invite you to share your own experiences in the comments. Has God ever sent you a small sign that changed the direction of your life? Maybe it was a person, a moment, or a truth you had been blind to until the right time. Your story might be the reminder someone else needs tonight. And if you would like to hear more stories of hope, resilience, and second chances, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us keep these stories alive. May the Lord bless you, guide your steps, and meet you exactly where your heart is searching. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.